city-owned buildings in the current year's budget. Excuse me. City owns about 54 structures that were assessed. That goes from the community center, which is our single largest building, down to our smallest picnic shelter in our parks. We selected a consultant, EMG Consulting, to do that assessment of city-owned facilities for us. They provided discrete reports. A lot of our reports are bundled by property. So for instance, this building doesn't have its own report. It's part of the City Hall report. So the parking lot, the garage, City Hall, and Civic Hall, 4 pieces of property are on a single site. And so we've got fewer than 54 reports, but roughly that many structures and facilities that were assessed. In addition, we added McMinnville Water and Light to the contract, and at McMinnville Water and Light's cost, they had their own facilities assessed. I'll only be talking about city-owned and operated facilities tonight, and not all of them. The intention of this work session is to really have the first public assessment or public unveiling of the high-level numbers and issues that were identified in the assessments, to try to put some context around the assessment and to talk about some of our future steps that we'd like to take. I think you have all seen this graphic. Before I explain it to you, I'm going to sort of back up a little bit and talk about the work of the firm that assessed the facilities, and then I'm going to dissect this document, so we'll come back to it in its entirety a little bit later. The facilities assessment was a pretty comprehensive review. Each report includes an executive summary, key findings. There's this thing called the Facility Condition Index, which I'll explain a little bit more in future slides. We looked at ADA accessibility. We looked at the seismic issues for some of our facilities, but not all of them. And we've got the opinions of probable costs. I'm going to talk a little bit about just the pieces of the work. Each report is very detailed. There's a lot there. Tonight, the detail you'll see is really illustrative and an example. We're not trying to kind of quantify everything to you. Talk a little bit about the Facility Condition Index. It's essentially one of the ways to provide an objective indication about a building's overall condition, and relates to both the needs of the facility as well as the replacement value of the facility. Each of our facilities was assigned a condition index, whether new and well-maintained, subject to wear but serviceable, subjected to hard or long-term wear, and end of useful or serviceable life. And beyond that, the deficiencies and all the life cycle needs for all the facilities were identified, and we've come up with immediate 3-year, 5-year, 10-year, and 20-year investments that need to be made in the facilities as they stand now. We looked at a variety of types of improvements. Excuse me, they're identified as plan types in the report, and it's sort of not so important to understand the definition of plan types, but to look at the type of improvements that were assessed. Safety, performance and integrity, accessibility, environmental needs, retrofit, adaptation, and life cycle renewals are the big categories. So this isn't a bad news report. There's a significant need in the organization, the community. So I'm going to try to make sure that I stay there. One of the pieces of good news is that while there are a number of immediate needs of our facilities, they're relatively small needs related to safety and accessibility and environmental needs. So the bulk of the condition assessment work shows up on this pie chart. It's a little bit hard to read, but the giant blue segment, about 3/4 of the pie, are related to the life cycle, long-term use of the buildings. And so most of the improvements are, you need to fix a roof when you need to fix the roof. You need to replace a heating system when you need to replace a heating system. You need to upgrade plumbing when you need to upgrade plumbing. And there are relatively few safety, environmental, and accessibility needs for the facilities. Now we'll sort of break down that big graphic a little bit and tell you how we got where we are. We launched this effort last year prior to the strategic plan being approved, but by this time last year, we had a pretty good sense of what our strategic initiatives were going to be, and we relied on that draft strategic plan work to really inform that conversation, and we really focused on the issue of core services. As we worked our way through the strategic priorities, it's apparent to me, and I believe this to be the case, that at least 4 of our strategic priorities either influence or are influenced by this facilities assessment. In addition to capacity, our ability to be a safe and resilient community, our ability to provide services that promote economic prosperity and engagement and inclusion are all influenced in one part or another by the facilities through which we provide our services. And so as we look forward into the process, what we need to do is to be able to tell our story, we need to effectively plan, and we need to figure out how to fund our needs. And we're talking primarily about facilities, but we've got fleet and equipment needs as well. Those are the other significant components of the city's capital budget. And so while we're going to spend most of our time talking tonight about facilities specifically, keep in mind that we've got these other capital resources called fleet and equipment that we'll need to talk about as well. And so when we broke up the buildings at the executive team level, we tried to look at, do they fit neatly or semi-neatly into categories? It's sort of bubbly because it's not all completely neat, but we have a cadre of facilities that are relatively new and relatively good condition, and preventive maintenance is really the key to keeping and maintaining those buildings to be functional, and or there are facilities that may have their own revenue stream, like the water reclamation facility. And so we think that these facilities that are identified really are those facilities that we just need to be diligent and consistent about making investments in those properties as we need to do that. Just as an example of that, I picked the condition assessment for the police department. It's a big building, 35,000 square feet. It's relatively new, just over 10 years old. And when we look at the immediate short-term, near-term, mid-term, and long-term, there are significant costs associated with that building, but a number of those medium-term and long-term costs will change if you're effective in spending the money immediately and near-term. And so for a building of its size and of its age, relatively few immediate and short-term needs for that. We've got sort of a big lumpy middle, facilities that we are pretty committed to for a variety of reasons, but there are significant needs, and we need to really figure out effectively how we're going to invest in and improve those facilities. The example I picked this time was the library. So it's an older building when compared to the police department, built in 1981. It's about half the size, and when you look at the immediate and short-term needs, they're significantly higher for that building than they are for the police department, for instance. And so while some of the medium and long-term needs are maybe more in scope with the size and the age of the building, there's some more pressing financial implications for a building like the library, and we think that's sort of illustrative of the other facilities that are in that mix. In the end of useful life category, we have our oldest, sometimes largest, sometimes most complicated buildings, and a particular example is the building next door, City Hall. It's only a 5,300 square foot building, but you can see over the next 20 years, it needs nearly $1 million of investment. It was built in 1940. So one of the things that I think is important to note, and I'll get to it again as I wrap up the presentation, is that the end of useful life conversation doesn't just mean we're not going to make an investment, we're not going to keep the building. I'm actually going to talk specifically about some of the things I think we're going to need to do over the next couple of years to make those decisions, but knowing that there are older facilities that haven't had a lot of money spent on them over a long period of time, those buildings will have different needs needs, and there's sort of a different calculus that we have in mind as we're making decisions about services and deploying services. A number of the future steps that we need to take are included on this slide. We need to evaluate the preventive maintenance program. It was just provided to us today. We haven't looked at it. We know it's draft. We think the picture on the cover might be the Corvallis City Hall, but we're not sure about that. So it's draft, and the water and light facilities are all mixed in together. So we need to take a serious look at that preventive maintenance plan, create a final draft, really evaluate what we're going to do in terms of our preventive maintenance. I think we need to invest in phase 1 of a building master plan and feasibility study, and you'll see a proposal in the budget that comes to you for your review and approval in May and June. Phase 1 is a thoughtful assessment of the facilities that we have, how we deploy our services, what our footprint is. We have what I refer to as a constellation of facilities around the community, and that's not a bad thing, but we also have a lot of single and two-story uses that are sort of diffuse around the community, and particularly in the downtown. Our footprint downtown is fairly significant. We hear a lot of conversation about the county's footprint, and I'm not picking on the county, it's just there are partners in this as well. And I've had at least a couple of meetings with representatives of Yamhill County about their facilities needs and their footprint. Our footprint hasn't changed very much in the last decade or so. I think the police department was the last significant acquisition other than parks and open space. But in terms of built facilities, our footprint's been pretty stable for a decade or so. The county's footprint has grown a lot in that 10 years. But we still have a significant footprint, and we have a bunch of what I call single-story uses, and I understand the irony of saying that when I sit in a second-story building, but we've got a bunch of 1- and 2-story buildings kind of scattered primarily around the downtown area, but not entirely. I think part of the conversation we need to have is that the effective and efficient and appropriate way to deliver services in our community, or should we be talking about more consolidated utilization of facilities? I think the county will have a similar series of conversations. We're a little bit ahead of them in terms of where we are with our building assessment. They're going to go through a similar program this year that we have been through for the last year. But they're also in tune with their footprint and how hard it is to maintain all the buildings they have, and how they now have sort of a diffuse set of services around the downtown. So in my mind, the conversation that the county has is not about moving the county out of downtown. It's not about moving the city out of downtown. In fact, I think that's a huge mistake to contemplate in large scale. Civic presence is crucial to a fantastic downtown, and that's something that we have. The question is, do you have it deployed with the right footprint, or are you spread out too much? Are you really doing a good job of efficiently and effectively delivering services where they're needed, where they're accessible, that sort of thing? So that phase 1 building master plan really starts to look at some of those issues, and it's going to be informed by the facilities needs assessment, not just by the stuff in the red balloon, but in the stuff in all of the balloons. We also want to take a look at options for a centralized facilities maintenance program. The mayor can't answer this question because he knows it. Does anybody know who the facilities manager is for this building right here? It's me. Does anybody need my wife to come testify about what a bad match that is for my particular skill set and life experience? Jenny is the facilities manager for the library. We don't have a centralized facilities management function. That's something that we need to seriously take a look at, because what happens is we have 10 different people in charge of 10 different facilities. And while some of us are better at this sort of thing than others, none of us were actually trained and educated and desire to be facilities managers. One of the things that we'll be talking about is the possibility of working with Yamhill County. Yamhill County has a centralized facility maintenance program. They do a pretty good job of maintaining their facilities, and they have a much bigger footprint than we do, obviously not just in town, but across the county. And so we've already met with them to talk to them about what our needs are and whether they may be able to serve those needs through a partnership. We want to budget resources to fund some of the immediate improvement needs that we've identified identified, and you'll see those proposed in the budget. Not forgetting what the other significant capital needs are. We want to explore what options we may have for a centralized fleet and equipment program. And because we've got infrastructure above and beyond buildings, we need to make sure that we update our infrastructure master plans as needed. So that gets us back to how that whole graphic sort of hangs together. For the executive team's purposes, this made sense to us. This was a sort of an easy graphic way to capture a lot of complicated moving parts and their relationships with one another. We're certainly interested in your feedback about whether you think this graphic makes sense, whether it needs more information, different information. And at this point, I want to just move on to any questions or observations that you have. Again, the purpose of tonight's meeting was to really share with you the high-level findings of this building assessment, to identify what we think some of our pressing needs are, and to chart a path forward in some thoughtful ways. And any questions you have about any aspect of the presentation, I stand ready to answer, and most of the executive team is here and can chip in as needed.
Thank you, Jeff. Let's open it up to council for questions or observations.
Jeff, I had a question regarding the police department example you gave. It really accelerates after that 3-year mark, and what makes it accelerate?
I didn't bring that report with me. The facilities manager isn't here. He's in Florida right now. So the substitute facilities manager is here, and I'm not going to put Captain Simons on the spot. But when you get out to 10 or 20 years and the building's already 11 years old, it's probably there's probably a significant roof repair in there. There's probably a significant upgrade, repair, replacement to some of the heating and air conditioning systems. So it's going to be, big systems in the building that drive costs like that, whether it's a roof or a heating system or significant investment in, we've got a lot of technology in that building. My guess is there's some projected end of life for some of the technology that's in the building as well.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions or comments?
Yeah, I'm
Go ahead,
having
Remy.
some issues with my microphone. I was wondering if you could help me with that.
Yes, I can. I find that tossing it against the wall is not as
Keeps
effective
falling
as
down,
bouncing
and
it on the
I like
floor.
to have it close
So,
up here.
Right.
I'll try the throwing it after I ask my questions. In the individual reports, when will we be seeing those?
When would you like to see them? There's a boatload of information there. We can provide some summary information for you. There's a lot of repetitive information because every report can be read on its own. So the description and definitions and scope of work and executive summary about what goes into the report, there's probably 2 or 3 pages that are the same for every report. There's also a bunch of photos in the report. There are tables. I actually think the preventive maintenance program, once we assess that and get it into a final draft form, would be useful for you. But the kind of information you want, it's all out there. We can provide those copies to you. We could give you each a different report for you to take a look at and see if it's the kind of information you'd like to see for a bunch of things. Do you really want to know about the Cozine Creek pump station, or are you really just interested in the community center? I mean, we can slice and dice the information however you'd like us to.
So would that be, currently is the information summarized to a degree for each building by the company that did the reporting?
Yes. So there's a table for each piece of each site in each report, and it's a kind of a partial page. So in the report that describes this property here, there are 4 graphs, one for this building, one for the garage, one for City Hall, one for the surface areas, the parking lot and the sidewalk, and then there's a combined table that rolls all that information together.
Okay. I think it would be great to have it, not understanding that, truthfully it sounds like it's probably hundreds and hundreds of pages.
Mm-hmm. It is hundreds and hundreds of pages.
Maybe I wouldn't be able to go through it with a fine tooth comb, but I would appreciate having it to be
Sure.
look over. So then, does it include the zoning for each of the buildings?
I don't think we got to land use on it, but that would be pretty easy for us to do. We already have, particularly in the downtown area, we already have a map of all the city and county-owned property designated, and it would be easy to do a zoning or a land use layer on top of a map like that.
Okay, I would be interested in the zoning on
I
it.
think we can come up with that.
And then you,
Most of them are going to be zoned public facilities. At least that's the theory. Because they're public facilities.
the surrounding area, I
The
guess.
surrounding areas would also be identified, yes.
Okay. And then, when you were talking about the buildings that are kind of at, what did you say, end of life?
Nothing is designated as actual end of life, but when you look at the investments that are required over, 5, 10, 20 years, I think it's legitimate to ask the question, should we be investing $2 million in City Hall in the next 20 years? Should we be investing $750,000 into the chamber office building over the next 20 years? One of my other favorite poster children, if you will, for this exercise is the fire station, which outwardly looks like a nice building and it's been well kept, but it's an older facility. We assessed the seismic needs of that building because that's a building that needs to function after a shake. It can't just fall down. The cost of bringing that building up to current seismic upgrades and addressing all of the 20-year needs in the condition assessment are about 2.5 times the cost of building a brand new station from the ground up. And so it's those kinds of assessments that we'll need to do for all of these facilities. And that doesn't mean we walk away from the fire station, but you've heard a number of reports from the fire chief about the challenges of that building and the location of that building. And then when you couple it with these significant cost impacts, it really drives the conversation about, okay, what's the best use of the public resources when it comes to providing that particular service.
That's all I have for now, because you're going to keep going, right?
I don't have to. No, this is the question part.
I know, sometimes you have questions in the middle.
Oh, no. I don't have questions in the middle.
Oh, no.
Not tonight.
Okay, when are you coming back with more, other than the electronic or whatever document?
So that's part of what I'd like to hear from you. We'll definitely be talking about this larger issue in the context of the budget that comes to you in late April, early May. I said, well, the meeting will be in mid-May, but they'll have it in their hands sooner than that. When I said April, I got Marcia's attention. So there'll be, some of this stuff will be addressed in the budget presentation. So we'll definitely be talking about it as part of the overall city budget. One of the things that might be useful is we can share some examples of reports with the council. We can do some additional work on summary information and then get some feedback from you on which path you'd like to go down in terms of, do you want to look at all the buildings at once? Do you want to look at just a certain cadre of buildings? Do you want us to come up with, we could come up with different plans for each of the colored balloons kind of thing. So getting some initial feedback from you and having this be sort of an iterative administration and policy process would work. And we certainly could schedule additional work session time later this spring. This is a multi-year conversation, quite frankly. I mean, if you just put it in the context of the sheer dollar amount, that unmet need for general fund occupied facilities is about 175% of the transportation bond that was passed a few years ago. That was a $24 million issue, I think, and we're looking at a $34 million unmet need for general fund facilities. And that was a 3-year conversation from beginning to a voter-approved measure, and then another 3+ years to make all the improvements. So this is a long-term conversation in the community and with this body.
Well, the feedback that I hear a lot just in talking to people corresponds to what you were starting to talk about with your single-story use buildings, is that that there's wonder as to why there is so much wrapped up in small houses around town. So I'm certainly interested in pursuing that aspect of it.
I think that phase one study that I described on the 2 slides before this one.
And you indicate
Captures
that'd be to us probably in July, June.
What's that?
That phase one,
No, we've built money into the budget for next fiscal year to do that work.
okay, to do that work.
Yeah.
Okay.
So when you move your office to the old fire department, are you going to have the pole in yours? Or?
No, I don't want to go in. Don't make me go in there.
Other questions, comments? Zach?
Yeah, I think I'd be interested in reading the whole report.
All 24 of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, just send it out electronically maybe, and then we can,
We probably won't send it out electronically. It's
Or I could take
it's
it by
massive. We'll figure out a way to get that information to you. My guess is we might do, is Scott in the building? A Dropbox or an FTP site or something like that, so you
No
can
idea
get
what that means,
access
but okay.
to it electronically.
Okay.
okay.
I don't want to kill all the trees it would take to
Oh, yeah.
produce
I can do it digitally,
7 versions of that.
however you want to do that. The pie chart you show of condition assessment of city-owned buildings, is that a percentage of those 54 buildings that get categorized as one of those categories, or is that a dollar figure?
So of 100% of the improvements that are identified in the reports, that's the percentage that are related to life cycle, the percentage that are related to safety, the percentage that are related to environment. So each of those plan types, each of those categories. So of a great big number, 75% are related to.
So each facility gets multiple dings.
Oh, sure. Some
those
facilities, some of our newer facilities, for instance, it's all about life cycle investment. You just have to make preventive maintenance investments and go do it. And some of our facilities, there are significant performance issues that need to be addressed. There are a couple of smaller facilities that have some safety impacts that we need to deal with. So each of the reports has a little graphic. I call it the donut, or maybe we'll call it a bagel. There's a bagel with colored slices in it, and it describes the percentage of investment that's required over 20 years in each of those categories.
Do they dive into their calculus on those yearly assessments?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, there's project specific. It gets down to, we think the electrical improvements are going to cost you this much, and you got to do it in this particular year.
And then does the report take into, you touched on the time loss of management in running their facility as opposed to running, does that take that?
It's just an assessment of the buildings and the facilities themselves. It doesn't get into the service level impact. It doesn't address the impacts of having a decentralized facilities maintenance function. There's none of that. It's just about the physical structure.
And sorry, it does cover fleets or it does not cover fleets?
It does not cover fleet. We identified fleet and equipment because there are big capital needs there as well. We just assessed the built facilities.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments?
Go ahead, Wendy.
Okay, thanks. I had a couple of, well, I guess mine might not be questions that you'll answer right now, but to give you some guidance about some of the things that I wonder in this that whet our appetite about what it contains. I had questions about how, what the thinking was that put them into those separate balloons. Like you gave us one example of that building, but I would be interested in seeing in numbers what bumps a building up into that category of end of useful life, and what are your options with regards to that? Like how quickly does it then become you're just throwing your money away to maintain it? Like those types of questions come into my mind with regards to what we need to do.
And in fact, as you look through the reports, there's actually a graph for each facility that shows that facility condition index, the FCI, and it shows what happens to that line as you either make investments or don't make investments. So even though we may not have a building at the end of its useful life, if you don't spend the money at now 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, you see how quickly you can approach or how slowly you can approach the end of useful life for a facility. So that information is in each individual report.
That would be really interesting to see, so we can kind of get our heads wrapped around, well, what does that mean specifically, and how quickly does action need to be taken, you know, because we are currently using those buildings. So that was one of the questions that I had. And then the other thing, I really liked how you gave those examples, that you gave the numbers. If we had data like that for all of the different facilities to be able to see comparatively, I mean, that would be really helpful. And then there was one other thing that I had a question about that I forget right now. So you can go on to Adam. I'm sure I'll remember in just a second.
Adam?
Definitely looking forward to phase one when that comes together. Like Remy and Zach, I would like to look at the full report. I'm definitely not going to go through it with fine-tooth comb, but I'd like to be able to jump around and dive into buildings that pique my interest. Outside of the aging fire station, is there any other buildings in this report that needs seismic upgrades to just because of their use?
So let me try to remember which ones. We did a seismic assessment at the water reclamation facility. We did a separate seismic assessment from this process for the fire station.
There's the airport building as well, but I wasn't sure if that.
Did we look at the airport too, Mike? There were maybe 3 or 4 buildings that we tacked on a seismic assessment during this work effort. We didn't for the police department or for this building because they have been built since the codes changed and they're built to current earthquake codes. We didn't assess the library because there were some fairly significant seismic improvements made to the library about 10 years or so ago. A number of our older buildings we didn't assess because we felt like the numbers were going to be big enough without that assessment that we would probably be faced with a serious conversation about what investment we needed to make in the building before we did any seismic reviews. So for most of the buildings, we did not do a seismic assessment. Mike, was there something more that we did include?
We did the community center because it has a lot of the IS technical infrastructure for the city. We did wastewater services because it's a alternate emergency operations center. And we did Oregon State Police because of its critical functionality. But those are the only 3 that we did the high-level seismic work. There wasn't any actual detailed engineering or detailed seismic studies done. It sets out the high-level condition of those facilities and then recommends that it go to a more detailed seismic analysis if you're interested in making upgrades related to seismic.
Outside of the Chamber of Commerce building, is there any other buildings in this report that are leased? Or at the airport, the OSP building as well?
Yeah, so the building, Oregon State Police, what about the Riverside House?
Yeah, so the wastewater services owns a single-family residence off of Riverside Drive, so we did a condition assessment of that. We also did a condition assessment of city-owned hangars that are leased to tenants. So I think that was it from a lease standpoint.
I think that's all.
Cosine House? Is that?
That's not ours.
The Cosine House is owned by the Downtown Association.
In that phase 1 master plan and feasibility, will that kind of look at the value of, say, the chamber building, and if we were to?
Yeah, we haven't written the scope for that study yet, but we can certainly do that.
Okay.
Wendy, did your question come back?
I think maybe one of the reasons I forgot was because it wasn't really well formed, but I guess the thing that, so a little asterisk by this, but I guess there are so many moving parts, and I know that we're all feeling like we need to really understand those parts in relation to how we're making decisions now and into the future. One of the things Mike and I talked about when I first came on was how if you don't do maintenance now, then all of a sudden the roads will get beyond a point where it then becomes way more expensive, like you were talking about.
Right.
So understanding that for all of these buildings, and how we prioritize within the bounds of, the realities that we're faced with. So I think I would be in support of seeing the whole plan, just to be able to internalize, go through, not read all word for word probably, but internalize like the big picture of the information that we've been given, so that we are prepared with kind of that background information to be able to make those decisions. And it was helpful, like I said, also to have like kind of a condensed, like how it came about that these different categorizations were made, and whatever processes you're going to go through to make it digestible for us will be helpful as well. So I guess that was my high level of what, I was feeling with regards to this data. There's a lot of data to internalize, but I think that it would be helpful for us to have that background information.
Yeah, there's an old African proverb about how to eat an elephant, and it's one bite
Right.
at a time. So, figuring out how to get you the information and how to share the information in the community in a way that folks can really process it and think about it and move to some conclusions is going to be really important.
From my perspective, I appreciate just when you're taking a look at the facility condition assessment and how you've broken those into the three pieces gives us a sense of what that is. When we're looking out 20 years, in that Mac Water and Light has done the same study, and in no way do they have the extensiveness of what we've got here at the city. It's much easier to take a look at what's happening there. And they have some newer buildings. But you got to remember, we're going to have roofs on every building, in 20 years. We could have windows in every building that would need to be taken a look at, carpet and some of those things. So that really puts that number up. But that's typical operations that we're going to have. I think the big thing that we're going to really need to take a strong look, and as Adam says, when we get that phase one assessment, that's going to be very helpful to us. But is just to take a look at the safety areas, the retrofitting, those things that become much more functional for us. And we're just going to have to weigh those out, I'm guessing, as we're taking a look at that. My sense is we've got a lot of data, but as we sit around the room, department heads know the functionality of your buildings better than anyone. And I think that's where we're going through that phase one, get a sense of what's going on until we get to a point where there's a policy question of where we go and what we do. That's where we need to come in and be cognizant of this. So, I would say when we start seeing some direction from our department heads in the building of that phase one, we might have another work session, Jeff, and just bring us up to speed. If we could park electronically the data someplace where we could go in at our leisure and just take a look at us. Some would want to do that, others don't, but it gives us an opportunity to delve. I mean, I look around the room and we've got a few people that have some building background and understand that piece very well and could be very helpful from that perspective. So I know this is just the start of something that's going to be much bigger. I also enjoy a little bit of looking at, I think it was the statement of how we could possibly utilize in our equipment and some of our facilities there. Because I think we could maybe at some point partner up with other entities out there. I know like the county now has their big new garage and maintenance building, Mac Water and Light. At some point, we've been talking about a combined with them building a fueling station that the city could possibly participate in that. We have our maintenance area that abuts right up to Water and Lights area. So I think there's some opportunities to look more strategically and pooling some dollars maybe in some of those areas too. But again, I look at the experts, and the experts sit around this table and will give us some insights from that perspective. Go ahead.
Sorry to jump back in. This isn't necessarily specific to this report, but is more about a kind of functional issue of addressing this. And pardon me if the question sounds naive, but I'd rather ask it than not. So when you get a report like this with, say, the fire department, and we've been hearing for years, the fire department has significant needs for improvement, and then you have this report come in, and it's such a crucial element to the functioning of the city daily, let alone in the wake of a disaster. Why, and not without realizing that everything has to be evaluated and you have to take specific steps, but why when there's so much kind of overwhelming information for one facility, and one facility that's so crucial, and I suppose you could argue any facility was crucial, but a facility like that, why put it through a year and a half, or 2 years of strategic planning, instead of, you've just said it would cost less to build a new fire department than it would to bring this one up to where it needs to be over a short term. Why not just start that process of, okay, well, we know what our next steps would be for building a new fire department. So even without knowing exactly every element of it, what would stop us from just pursuing that one piece while the rest is still in planning?
It's not a naive question at all. And in fact, I'm not going to suggest that we're going to put all 54 facilities through the exact same process, because they have different needs. There's at least 3 different clear paths to me, because each of those colored bubbles call for a different solution set. And even inside those colored bubbles, there may be individual structure that was, we say, wait a minute, we're not going to actually go down this path with this building because, and I think the fire department is a good example of that. If we know it costs 2.5 times to fix the building we have than to build the building, if we know that we wouldn't build a new building where the current building is, if we know we're having active conversations with other regional partners about a different model of providing fire and EMS service, does it actually make sense to put that building through that other process? I mean, I think you made the argument that no, and my proposal wasn't we're going to treat every building the same. In fact, our next step at the staff level is to really decide, okay, when we do this larger multi-facility master plan, if you will, which buildings really need to be in that, which should be in that, and which need to be on their own path. Whether that path is, hey, we just need to slap a coat of paint on it and replace the carpet in 5 years, versus there's a crying need to address this critical facility in a different method. So we'll go through that assessment and we'll bring that information to you.
Thank you. Can I ask one more follow-up question? It's more of a history question than a question about this current report. Did we have an assessment done like this in any recent or past history?
Doubt it. We turn to the guy who's been here the longest.
Mike, I think that's going to you.
We're looking at.
So, Mike, how were we making these decisions previous to this about how to prioritize the maintenance and the decision-making like this?
I think every department head that's been in charge of a facility over the past 2 or 3 decades probably had a different approach to that. This is the first sort of collective body of information that gives you an idea, sort of from a system standpoint, where the needs are, and it really just becomes a baseline for us to start to make priority decisions and to try to be a little bit better about making choices about what you do. But, as an example, for me, the last couple months, I've been sending project managers to get quotes to clean gutters and remove ivy and talk about repainting a parking lot, and you just do what you know needs to be done, and you do what you can afford within the budget you have, so. And I think each department head would tell you the same thing. Jenny's had some significant struggles over the past few years with HVAC equipment and elevators and things like that. And Susan has some interesting stories about discoveries she's made at the community center and the aquatic center. So we have managed the best we could with the knowledge we had at the time. And certainly this effort has been quite informative to give us a better baseline level of knowledge for what we have.
So the department heads that are responsible for the facilities have been paying attention to the facilities as best they can within their, and putting it on their regular budget requests. Okay, that makes sense. And thank you very much for wading through, well, first of all, collecting all the information. I think this is a great approach for us to be able to look at the priorities that we'll need to be making with regards to how we budget our money and moving forward, so we can be as strategic as possible over the whole of our investments in capital equipment. So, thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Okay, so any further discussion or questions for Jeff from the dais? Seeing none, I'm just going to turn to department heads. Anything you'd like to share from your perspective with us in this discussion? I mean, we're all a team as we're working and looking at this.
Where's the best place to buy a bucket, Susan?
We do currently have sandbags and buckets in the basement of the community center. The only thing I would add from my perspective, being new in the last couple of years, in this year's current budget cycle, we asked for and were allocated $75,000 for a Parks and Recreation facilities master plan. So it's sort of that model that Jeff talked about for all of the buildings. We just signed a contract with a consultant for that. So that's something that we'll look at. Funding potential, planning potential for the next 30 years for recreation needs, and we'll build off of these condition assessments.
The one thing that I do have access to that's not in the reports that would be available is the seismic study that was done on the fire station. I can give that to Mr. Towery to make sure that's included so that you have it available through your electronic means.
Jeff, anything further you need from us as a council?
No, I appreciate your attention. Great questions. I know I'll have follow-up conversations with our colleagues who aren't able to be here tonight.
Okay. Well, we'll then just look for this to come back to us at a later date, and we'll probably have a discussion along the way. So with that being taking care of that discussion, our work session will go ahead and close, and then we'll reconvene at 7 o'clock for our regularly scheduled council meeting.